Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Alex Colvin, and I am the Public Programs Curator here at the Alabama Department of Archives and History. And I am so glad to see a wonderful audience here in our Farley Auditorium, but I'm also really glad to say hello to our virtual audience coming to us from Facebook and YouTube. Welcome to our last lecture in our 2021 Food for Thought series. But never fear, Food for Thought will continue next year. We're gonna have 12 new lectures, and we're gonna post that schedule on social media this afternoon. But let me go ahead and invite you to next month's presentation. On Thursday, January 20th, 2022, at noon Central Standard Time, Dr. Brian Reinsflesh will present George Galpin's Intimate Empire, a cross-cultural family in the Native South. Now that will be both an in-person event and it will also live stream to our Facebook and YouTube channel. I'd also like to invite you to Research Rundown on January 10th at noon, as reference archivist Carly Ann Burkett will discuss early Alabama land records. I'd like to take a quick moment to recognize that our 2021 Food for Thought series was sponsored by the Friends of the Alabama Archives and made possible through a grant with the Alabama Humanities Alliance. And you can help support programming like Food for Thought by joining the Friends of the Alabama Archives. And for our virtual audience, we're gonna put a link below in the comments. And for those in person, we have a card outside that you can use. All right, now it is my pleasure to introduce you to today's speaker, Linda Derry. Derry is the site director of Old Cahawba Archaeological Park, an historic archaeologist with a graduate degree from the College of William and Mary. She has worked for state historic preservation offices in Alabama, Virginia, Massachusetts, and Illinois. For over 35 years, she has coordinated grassroots efforts to save Cahaba, leading the state's acquisition of more than 600 acres of the site for preservation and operation by the Alabama Historical Commission. She's here today to present discoveries at the site of Alabama's first state house. Please welcome with me, Linda Derry.
Howdy do. Can you hear me? All right, good. Well, yes, we're going to talk about some new discoveries at the site of Alabama's first state house. Let me see if I can get my equipment running here. As you may know, Alabama's first state house was built in Cahaba, which is located in Dallas County, 13 miles southwest of Selma at the confluence of the beautiful Cahaba and the mighty Alabama. Today, it's a ghost town. The state capital was removed in 1826 to Tuscaloosa, but the town went on to prosper as a county seat of Dallas County, which in 1860 had the fourth highest per capita wealth in the whole United States. So the people that lived in Cahaba at that time were the wealthiest of the wealthy, and of course, all of their enslaved laborers. The town wasn't abandoned until the Civil War and after the county seat was removed to Selma. Many of Cahaba's fine homes were dismantled, floated upriver, and reassembled in Selma. So actually, when you visit the historic district in Selma, you're in a way visiting Old Cahaba. If you come to Cahaba, you're going to be able to walk the abandoned streets. All the ruins are covered in Spanish moss. You can read the epitaphs in the graveyards. And every spring, the old-fashioned plants bloom again to show you where the gardens used to be and what those people thought were beautiful. So it's for those that like to explore, it's quite an experience. The Wall Street Journal called us the antebellum Pompeii because of the ruins and then also beneath the soil. And Teresa, you're in this picture, someone in our audience. Just beneath the soil, if you peel back the sod, are the foundations or the footprints of hundreds of houses that stood at Cahaba and thousands of lives that were lived. As a historical archaeologist, I'm often reminded that we're just digging up old garbage, but old garbage is wonderful. It tells you a lot of stories that they might not have written down, and you can tell a lot about people. And I often say, if you don't believe me, tonight go sneak over and go through your neighbor's garbage, and trust me, you'll find out a lot more about them than they would ever tell you. Today, Cahaba is an archaeological park operated by the Alabama Historical Commission, which is a state agency like the archives where we're standing today. And but I also want to give thanks to the Cahaba Foundation, the Cahaba Advisory Committee, along with countless others that helped in the grassroots effort to raise funds to acquire over 600 acres of the old town site, a half acre at a time over the last 35 years. A lot of lawyers' fees, a lot of titles had to be cleared. And I think some of those people are here in the audience, so raise your hands so people can appreciate you. Oh, don't be shy, because they have done a monumental thing. And they continue to help fund the development of the park. Now, before I get into the meat of this presentation, I want to do some sort of housekeeping or opening remarks. One, I want to do a land acknowledgement statement, and two, I want to tell you a little bit about the nature of historical inquiries. There's a growing trend this day to begin programs with a land acknowledgement statement that pays tribute to the original inhabitants of the land. I feel this is going to be my first land acknowledgement statement, and I feel like I really need to do it because hopefully by the end of my presentation, you will all understand why the forgotten or perhaps suppressed histories of Alabama's Native people must be centered in Cahaba's story. Because the lasting presence of Native Americans on the land, their presence as it's represented still on the land at Cahaba, was ultimately the key that allowed us to finally discover the true nature of Alabama's first state house, but more about that later. And so we all know that there's still plenty of Native Americans alive and well in Alabama, and maybe many of you here in the audience might claim some Native American heritage in your DNA. But at Cahaba, there were, that land where Cahaba sits today was acquired by the Creek of the Muskogee Nation in 1814 through the Treaty of Fort Jackson. The Muskogee lost about 23 million acres of land to the U.S. government at that point. Some of it was the richest land in Alabama, a lot of that cotton belt. This transfer of ownership opened a vast area to westward moving settlers and started Alabama's march towards statehood. Now, there may not have been any Muskogees living directly on the site of Cahaba when the treaty was signed in 1814, but indigenous people had lived on the land that became the town of Cahaba on and off for over 8,000 years. And one of the largest villages in the Alabama River drainage basin was thriving there about the time that the Spanish explorer Hernando de Soto and his entrada trekked through Alabama in 1540. Archaeologists call Cahaba's last native residents late Mississippian or the Pensacola culture, because we don't really know what they called themselves. But in my opinion, they likely were ancestors of the Creek and or the Choctaw people who the French encountered when they showed up in the 18th century. The second opening remark I wish to make is about history itself. Today, I'm going to challenge some long-held beliefs about Alabama's first state house. So I hope they're not going to be upsetting to some of you. I need you to open your minds and use your critical thinking skills because history work is basically like detective work. It is an ongoing process. In other words, when new evidence is discovered, we just have to update our understanding of the past. Furthermore, we can integrate information from a wide variety of sources and use various tools and techniques to solve history's mysteries. For example, I am a historical archaeologist, so I am very much aware that history is not just found here in the archives. There are also many historical clues buried out there in the relic landscape throughout Alabama. In fact, I have found that often you have to walk where the ancestors have walked before you can truly understand what a document is saying to you. After all, that's why we have so many preserved battlefields, right? Because people can't really understand how the battle went until you actually get out there and see the topography. And generally, in all cases, even when you're reading a book, context always facilitates understanding. So now, let's go on to the discoveries about the State House. Here's an image of Cahaba's State House that most of us carry around in our heads. I know I did. William H. Brantley had a Birmingham architect, Hugh Martin, create it for his 1947 book, Three Capitals. Personally, I love Brantley's book. He did a lot of really good research, but he relied solely on the written record. Consequently, I find that when he focuses in on physical nature of the old capital, he dropped back to armchair logic. As an archaeologist with a new set of tools and techniques, I just so long to revise those sections of his book based on our new discoveries. And I think if he were alive today, he would welcome this new evidence. Because in one footnote, he says, quote, "There is no known picture or painting of Alabama's first and vanished state house. It is believed that Mr. Martin's conception of the appearance of the state house is an accurate reconstruction as can be achieved with the known dependable information." So what do we know? Well, Alabama's first state house was built in Cahaba. It was built in Alabama's frontier capital. This was a town that was literally carved out of the wilderness practically overnight. The contract for building was let even before the Constitutional Convention began in Huntsville. And it was begun before steamboats plied that portion of the Alabama River. It was the first brick structure built in the region with bricks that had to be made on site. In August of 1820, a Mobile newspaper reported that the State House was nearly complete, but revealed that the brickwork had once before been completed. But due to, quote, "the badness of materials and the misfortune of the rainy season," it had to be taken down and begun again. So we actually have two first state houses that were at Cahaba. Jesse Bean, a resident of Cahaba, gave a 4th of July speech that same year, 1820, and it gives us a great insight into the community in which our first state house was built. And again, this is building the context. And I just love this quote, so I wanted to share it. This is what he said: "The Treaty of Fort Jackson gave us the country in which we are now assembled. My bosom is elated with the strongest emotions of pleasure when I cast my eyes around this assembly and behold so numerous a concourse of people, gathered together from all parts of the United States and formed into a friendly society on the banks of the Alabama River. Houses have been reared, forests cut down, and embellishments of properties effected as though it were by the hand of enchantment." Again, it practically happened overnight. He continued, "The immigrants brought with them wealth and politeness, intelligence, and virtue. A few months ago, we were all strangers, thrown by the hand of fortune into a new country. Advantageous circumstances have made many of us acquainted, and the perilous occurrences incident to the settlement of new countries have made us friends." I just think that's amazing. He's describing Cahaba as a community of strangers coming from all over and coming together to form a new society, essentially to form Alabama. Then in the summer of 1823, a visitor from Massachusetts said, when he wrote home, he said, "The State House is a brick building. It's 2 stories high and quite commodious. Of the apartments, the Representative Hall is on the 2nd floor, and the Senate chamber and several of the public offices are on the ground floor." I might mention that Brantley got this backwards. "The building serves for the courts of justice of Dallas County, and on the Sabbath, it is used as a place of worship." So our first state house was also used as a church. He also noted, "There are about 100 dwelling houses, for the most part small but neat buildings, the style of which is peculiar to that section of the country from whence the proprietor immigrated. The Virginian has his chimneys projecting from either end. The Georgian will have neither cellar nor oven. Even his kitchen is detached from his dwelling, while the Yankee has all 3 under one roof." Apparently, by just walking down the street, you could pick out that Cahaba was a community of strangers, just as Jesse Bean had described it, at least during the Capitol period. If you visit us and you go into the Capitol Era Cemetery, this community of strangers concept is even evident there. This is Elijah Clapp's tombstone. He was from Boston, and it's a quote, part of a poem from Alexander Pope. And it's saying, foreign hands closed his eyes, foreign hands arranged his limbs, foreign hands adorned his grave, by strangers honored and by strangers mourned. So his family was all in Boston, and he was there alone. So these new people, these strangers from all over the U.S., had to do this most intimate of jobs for this young man, young merchant at Cahaba. So I hope that gives you some idea of the community that the State House was built. So now what do we really know about the State House? Well, fortunately, there is a written document. Governor William Wyatt Bibb advertised for a contractor to build the State House. So this is basically a bid document. He lists the specifications of the important things that he wanted to see in his State House. He wanted the building to be 2 stories. He wanted it to be 58 feet long, 43 feet wide, and each story to be 12 feet. The ceiling in each story was 12 feet high. And the interior was to be divided above and below stairs by a passage 14 feet. So it had central hall 14 feet wide. And on one side of that hallway, on the first floor, would be 1 large room. Upstairs, it would be 2 rooms. And on the other side, it's reversed. Large room upstairs, 2 small rooms downstairs, with the largest body, the House of Representatives, meeting on the 2nd story and the Senate meeting on the 1st. Governor Bibb said he wants 2 chimneys and 8 windows on each end. And this is from Brantley's book, and it has 8 windows on the end and 2 chimneys. But Bibb also said there's going to be 12 windows on each front. And Brantley's, if you count them, there's only 9. So we're going to discard that picture. He goes into great detail. He wants each window to have 24 lights or 24 panes of glass, and each pane is to be 8 inches by 10 inches. So very easy to reconstruct that detail. It's a brick building. He talks about the brick walls. He says it has to be commenced 2 feet below the surface of the earth. So the contractor had to dig down 2 feet to start building that brick wall up. And it would be 2.5 brick thick up to the first floor, and the first floor has to be 3 feet off the ground. Now, this is important because all these stories, most of them myths about why the State House was moved from Cahaba to Tuscaloosa, was because this horrible flood that happened, is what we hear, and we've seen in some old textbooks, that happened in 1825. 1825 was a drought year. It never happened. But there was some high water in 1822, and there are some documents that have emerged through an archivist in another state, found it saying the water came up nearly 3 feet around the State House. And people have used that to say, see, the State House was flooded. Well, actually, it's telling you that no, it didn't quite get into the first floor of the State House. And the editor, those stories came from the editors of the Tuscaloosa, Montgomery, and Huntsville presses. And, they might be a little biased because they wanted the State House, right? And our editor at Cahaba said, no, that's not true, not true. And if you take this, again, my idea that you have to look at the physical evidence and the context as well as the documents to understand what they're saying to you. And so 2.5 brick up to the first floor, which is 3 feet off the ground. And then from thence, the walls would narrow to 2 brick wide. So this is where I come from originally in Virginia. We would call this a water course. So this is what it would look like on the outside of the brick wall. So it's wider up to 3 feet, and then it narrows up. He talked about the roof. He said the shingles are to be of cypress or heart pine. Now, and I know there's some people in the audience that are not going to like this, but there's no mention of a cupola, a dome, or anything in Governor Bibb's account. And I have looked, and I have never found an eyewitness account from the era of it. No one ever mentions there being a cupola on top of the State House. So I got intrigued, and I started to track down the story. There's a story that the cupola on a church in Lounsboro was brought from the Capitol building at Cahaba. I couldn't quite understand that because, I've just told you how tall this building was, 3 feet, 12 feet, 12 feet, then a roof, and then this wooden cupola on the top. That building collapsed in 1833. So I have a hard time accepting that wooden cupola could have fallen that distance and still survived in any kind of usable piece. So, and you all can kind of do the detective work of histories. Maybe somebody has the evidence that I would like to hear, and I'm open-minded and would like to hear it. But I try to detect that. And the first time I find that story is in 1931. And then from that point on, it's repeated and repeated. And it's sort of like the telegraph game, you know, and it's like, were there 8 oxen? Were there 4 oxen? Were there 12 mules? What year that it was done, and it all just changes and it grows and it grows. And I think it's very myth-like. So right now in reconstructing, I don't think I would put the cupola on top of the State House. The one consistent thing in this story is that it was Mr. Robinson who created the Methodist Protestant Church there, is supposedly the one responsible for it. And in the 1890s, there was a very extensive history written section in a memorial history of Alabama about him. And they mentioned the church, they mentioned the building, but they do not mention anything about him bringing a cupola. So again, I'm thinking this thing started in 1931, and it was Brandon here at the archives went and interviewed returning Confederate veterans for a reunion. And one gentleman came here, was born in Lounsboro, and he has an eyewitness account of the cupola being lowered onto the church. And he says that somebody told him that it came from Cahaba and maybe the capital at Cahaba, but he was born in 1842. So how old would he have to be before he would be conscious enough to remember that and to remember what he was told? So, and even Brandon admitted maybe the church was built in the 1840s, he thought, but this thing wouldn't have come until the 1850s. Now, the problem is the building collapsed in 1833. So even if it survived, who was secretly stashing this cupola somewhere so it could be moved in 1850? So again, for my money, I'm not going to put a cupola on the reconstruction of the State House. But if any of you find that smoking gun, please let me know, because we're going to be open-minded historians and accept new evidence when it comes. So based on Governor Bibb's description, the documents, this is what we think pretty accurately describes what our first State House looked like based on the documents. And this was a computer simulation done by Jeremiah Stager of the Office of Archaeological Research. So taking that, the Alabama Historical Commission decided to build what they considered to be a ghost structure. So on the site, we know what lot the State House stood. We were going to build this thing to suggest the size and shape and location of it. And this is what we came up for. So if you come to Cahaba, you can see this. Now, the problem is after we did the archaeology, it didn't turn out to be exactly this shape. So oops. As archaeologists, I would like to tell you, yeah, do your archaeology first, and that will save you a lot of pain and regrets. So let me tell you about the search for the physical remains of Alabama's first State House. And I have to say, I need to give credit to Eric Sipes and Will Lowe, who are great archaeologists that work with the Alabama Historical Commission. And I also want to mention the expedition program with the Alabama Museum of Natural History, especially that I want to mention them because I've heard that maybe that, you know, that's a wonderful program that they've had for decades. And I've heard that maybe it's not going to continue. So I want to give those kids a lot of credit that came and worked with me for a summer. So the search began. We thought, well, we're going to try to not do any ground disturbance. We're going to get ground penetrating radar and electromagnetic imaging. And the Natural Resource Conservation Service in 2014 brought all of their equipment and all their specialists, and they were doing a demonstration for their own people, but we got to get a look of what was there. And then in 2016, our agency had the University of Alabama Office of Archaeological Research come on and do some work again. And the idea was they figure out where it was, do some, dig some holes and find the State House wall. Well, this is what the results look like. And there's a lot of interpretation. You know, the black lines are how the archaeologist interpreted where he thought the walls of State House were, but you can just see what comes out of the equipment. So there's a lot of interpretation going on there, but they thought they had found where the wall was. So they opened some units, found something intriguing. And so I thought, well, this is a great idea. We can invite the public in so they could be part of uncovering Alabama's first state house. So no one's seen it since 1833. And now you can be part of opening up and uncovering and finding it. So the Alabama Archaeological Society came and people volunteered, and we opened a bunch of units. And sure enough, we found a really distinct wall. Now you have to understand, this thing collapsed in 1833, and it was the county courthouse at that time because the state house had moved to Tuscaloosa, the seat of government. The building was used as the county courthouse. The county paid people to come and salvage the brick, to clean up the lot and salvage the brick. And they were so anxious to recycle those bricks that they dug down, those 2 feet in the ground, and they salvaged those brick below the ground. And then in the hole, what we call the robber's trench, they put back the broken brick back in. So that's what we're finding mainly, is this dark soil stain filled with broken brick pats. And this is what it looked like there'd be the picture on your left is the top of it where you see the wall line. And then after we opened it up, and sure enough, it was 2 feet in the ground, just like Governor Bibb said it should be. So gosh, we thought that was it. So I spent the whole next summer with kids from the expedition program following that wall out, because we knew it should be either 58 or 43 feet long. Well, we spent the whole summer and it didn't turn out to be the State House wall. And bicentennial is coming up, so my bosses at the commission pulled me off to do other bicentennial things and broke my heart. But these other good archaeologists came in, and they are, in fact, I have to admit it, the ones that first discovered the walls of Alabama's first state house. And in this picture, you can see the plastic on the ground is where I dug, and the open units are where they found the walls. And just to give you how far this is from the Alabama River, it's about maybe 600 feet to 1,000 feet from the river. And it's just below where the Cahaba River enters the Alabama. And fortunately, on the front wall, there were some bricks still laid in place. And this is a picture of them. And just like Governor Bibb said, 2.5 brick wide. So the evidence is building up. This is the right size. The brickwork, it's pretty sure that we have the state house. It's where it's supposed to be. Now, this is a field drawing that they did of that front wall. And I want you to notice something where that blue arrow is pointing. This is not a straight wall. There's a little bump out. That wasn't in Brantley's picture. But, we probably should have known that that was a possibility, because you start looking around at other public buildings of that period. Near us in Wilcox County is the Wilcox County Jail. That this is probably about the depth of that little bump out, what it would look like. Of course, when it went to Tuscaloosa, it got a big bump out. It was like a whole vestibule. And at that time, this is the Montgomery State House, but the Maryland State House, which was used as the U.S. Capitol because, the Brits burnt Washington down at one point. And look, it's got that little subtle stylistic bump out on the front. So our State House was just as stylish as these other public buildings. So let's look at the back side of the State House. Now it looks, again, most of this was just brick rubble in that robber's trench, but very distinct, and you could follow it. It's a nice rectangular building. But when you match it up with the front of the building, is right. You see that? Good. I'm glad you see that. Our first State House was a trapezoid. Who knew? This is shocking news. I think it's pretty shocking. So if you were a crow flying over the State House in 1820, this is what it looked like. Isn't that amazing? Now, I know some of you are going, nah, or why? Okay, let me try to convince you. Now that I know it, it makes perfect sense, and I should have suspected it. And let me explain why. It goes back to that land acknowledgement statement I made. And let me tell you how that works. About the year 1500, some native late Mississippian Indians moved up the river from a more coastal area and established an outpost at Cahaba. And they built a village that looked something like this. it would have had a semicircular in shape. They would have built a palisade around their village and then dug a moat, just like a European castle around the palisade. And in the middle, that would probably be a ceremonial center or the chief's house. And they would, over the years, replenish Mother Earth. And the half of a century they lived there, by the time Hernando de Soto came through, there would have been a large circular, probably Indian mound in the center of this village. Okay, you got that, kind of got the picture of what that would have looked like. Just like this picture, only a mound in the middle. And this village disappeared in 1540, and we know what happened in 1540 in Alabama, right? That's when De Soto came through. And there's a picture of some pottery. Well, let's fast forward to 1817. We have no evidence of any settlement after 1540 at Cahaba until around 1817. The federal government had acquired all this land from the treaty with the Creek Indians. So they send their surveyors out to Alabama to lay in the township range lines and to create maps so they could commodify that land. So all these westward moving settlers that want to have Alabama fever can buy this land. So they produce the map. And this is the map of Cahaba. There's the last big bend in the Cahaba River where it enters Alabama. Can you see that? Well, right below that confluence, do you see a semicircle with a circle in the middle? Okay, Indian mound, moat. And they were nice enough to label that for us, the surveyors, and they call it ancient Indian work, which is interesting. So many of these people recognize that these large villages and mounds and earthworks were built by our native people in Alabama. Whereas later, in fact, after Lafayette was going to come to visit, all of a sudden, no, those native people didn't make that. These must have been French forts. But no, this is a very typical late Mississippian village pattern. Okay, so we have that map by the federal government. Now Governor Bibb gets his hands on about a square mile of land on which, free from the federal government, on which to build our first state capital with A, the whole town. So he gets to design this town. So here's a rendering of his map, what he created. And you can see in both locations, right below the confluence is that semicircle. So Governor Bibb was going to reuse this relic Indian landscape as the centerpiece of our first state capital. That's kind of amazing, I think. But on the Governor Bibb side, there's no longer a circle. Instead, there's this odd shape, must be a structure, and it kind of looks like it's a big building with a front and back portico, two side wings, two smaller porticos on those side wings. Can you think of a building that might look something like that, that might be very close to us right now? Yeah, I think he was trying to say, this is where I want to put the State House. Now, in case you don't believe me, let me point out something else about his map. All of the streets are 80 feet wide except the central street, which is Capitol Street, and it's spelled with an O. Capitol spelled with O means State House, right? A means the building. So at the end of this extra wide street named Capitol Street, he was going to put our first State House atop this Indian mound, which at the same time we're pushing the Indian people out of our way. He's going to show dominion over the soil by placing our seat of government atop the ceremonial Indian mound. Like, how amazing is that? We're getting inside Governor Bibb's head here now with archaeology, which is pretty amazing. Oh, and I also want to notice that he spelled Cahaba with a W. So I think if you're an Alabamian, you should spell Cahaba with a W, but that's my opinion. So he's got this grand plan. He's going to sell these lots, which he sold at greatly inflated prices with this beautiful map, and he creates the treasury for the state of Alabama. So he goes back to legislature and he says, I want the money to build this grand state house atop this Indian mound. And you know what they told him? No way. We're giving you $10,000, which is less money than they spent on the party for Lafayette when he showed up, because we're not going to decide until 1825 that they're really going to stay in Cahaba. If we stay in Cahaba, then he probably would have got his money to build that state house. But right now, you're getting $10,000. So he said, I'm going to build temporary accommodations for the legislature. And what he did is that centerpiece, he then reserved it. Even today, if you buy a lot there, it's the Capitol Reserve with an O. That's where that Capitol or State House was supposed to go. But he only had $10,000. So he moves over on an adjacent lot and he builds that temporary accommodations for the legislature. So that's where our first State House was built. Now it's kind of hard to see, so I'm going to show you another map. This is a portion of a map that was drawn by one of the early mayors or intendants of Cahaba. And you see that semicircle, and then he created an arch street around that moat. And you can see on this all the way around. See how all these lots are cut off? Okay. So this lot, 125, is where he built the State House. That lot is no longer rectangular, is it? Now, this is a LiDAR map that is a satellite imagery of the topography, so I hope you can see it. And on it, we have put in, this is the arch street. This curved line is the arch street. And these are the units that we opened in yellow. And in black is the outline of the foundation of Alabama's first State House. Beginning to get the picture here. When they built that State House, they bumped the front wall of that State House out so it would meet that arch street. So when you stepped out of the State House, you would be on the street and not several feet away from it. So the side walls were parallel to those streets. The front wall was parallel to, or nearly parallel to, that arch street. But you know, if you had been walking down the street, that crow would have noticed that it was trapezoidal. But if you're walking down the street, you might not even notice that it wasn't rectangular because you're stepping off the street into the front door of the house. Now, if you think that's really peculiar, it's not. Let me show you this map of Washington, D.C. Look there, there's the the federal Capitol is on a semicircular plot of land. And many of these, if you look at the lots and you blow them up, look, there's lots of not rectangular buildings in Washington, D.C. So Governor Bibb had lots of friends. He had been to Washington, D.C. He was modeling a whole town and a State House that was pretty high style for his mere $10,000 that he was doing. So Governor Bibb had a grand plan and his State House had to fit in it. And I just think it's amazing that he developed this landscape story. At the same time, we're pushing the Indian people out of our way. He's putting the State House on top of this ceremonial mound at the end of this extra wide vista. So he's telling us a story about ourselves through the landscape. And I think this also plays in the fact about the cupola. A cupola was an accepted thing to put on a public building at that time. But now we realize that this was a temporary accommodations. It was only $10,000. In Governor Bibb's mind, the big State House was going to be built in the center. So this would have been an auxiliary building along that semicircle. And he wanted all those buildings to face the grand presentation of the State House. So I think that explains why it has the bump out on the wall and why it may not have had a cupola. But again, you guys be the detectives and find me some evidence that will make me put a cupola on that house. So there you go. That's what Alabama's first State House looked like. And that's the end of my presentation. So if you have any questions, let me know.
Thank you so much. Yes, we have time for questions, both from our in-person audience, but also from our virtual audience. So if you're joining us from Facebook or YouTube, just put it in the comments and will be sent to me and I'll ask on your behalf. But for the time being, anyone in person, does anyone have a question for our speaker? Perfect. I'm going to bring the microphone to you so our virtual audience can hear you.
Linda?
Yes, ma'am.
I wondered if you would tell us a little bit about the buildings in Selma that were which ones, and also, for example, I know that St. Paul's Episcopal Church, the parish house was built with Cahaba bricks. And so do we know where those bricks exactly came from in Cahaba.
No, I don't know where those bricks exactly came from, other than they came from Cahaba. But this is a project that we're working on now, trying to document. There's lots of stories. I mean, swear, if you talk to people in Selma, every house in Selma came from Cahaba. But, getting the documentation to say that this house definitely came from Cahaba is hard, but we're working on it. I do know there's plenty of newspaper articles saying there's a steamboat with a barge pulling into town. Here comes some more frames of houses from Cahaba. If this keeps up, shortly, Cahaba will be out of business. So we know that's happening. There are the St. Paul's, the what do you call that building? That we know is documented in newspapers as being made out of bricks out of Cahaba. The Catholic Church built a school with a big mansard roof right next to City Hall. That was built from bricks from Cahaba. The house that used to be John Tyler Morgan's house in Cahaba that's very much documented as coming. But we're trying to pick away and find more, but we know dozens and dozens. And they'd say in the newspapers that, after the war, Cahaba was the old South. These were the planters. Selma was the new South. They had the industry that was built for the war effort. They had a lot of immigrant workers. They needed houses that much of Selma had been burnt. So they went and mined, and it was cheaper, they said, to go get these things from Cahaba than to make new brick and to make new lumber. So we know it happened, but documenting what house. And Robert Gamble, the architectural historian, is always reminding me that, they took these things apart and they put them back up in Selma. So they may not have looked exactly like they did in Cahaba. They would add some Italianate frou-frou. Like there's a lot of houses you see that have a federal fan light that probably dated to the 1820s, but now it's got all this Italianate stuff stuck all over it. There's two houses on Tremont that they say used to be first and second floor at Cahaba, and they made it into 2 workers' cottages. So that's an ongoing project. But yes, there were many of the houses in the historic district at Selma came from parts, but we're working on trying to document that. And I want to do that now because the people that, their grandparents told them we're starting to lose them. So I think we either do it now or never to try to track all those down. So if anybody knows any of those stories, let me know. I mean, it's all right as a story. Maybe we'll take that I think we've got some Auburn public history students that might be interested in helping us track down all those stories and get them documented. So not the best answer, but the best I have for you today.
Oh, we have another one in the back here.
Yeah. These are all Selma folks. They probably already know the answers.
And the rendition there, 2 questions. And I know it's just a sketch, an idea you said, but why wouldn't they have shown the panes in the windows and the ones that are all black? That's one.
Oh, those are just probably because he was lazy. The shutters are closed.
Shutters?
Yeah, we do know it had shutters.
Okay.
I think that those were added after the fact. But yeah, I think he just, was tired of drawing panes. But, some of them.
And then across the bottom, the rectangles, that always makes me think that it was airspace. Is that just
Yes, it was, first floor was 3 feet off the ground.
So it was 3 feet up, so there was that crawl
Yes,
space.
and yeah, we're still interpreting some of the archaeological evidence. It's a little sketchy on whether what was going on under the house, but I don't want to say because we haven't figured it out yet. But yeah, it would have been, so that would let some airflow underneath the house, underneath the structure.
The little balcony at the top would have been for the grand
Yes,
entrance, I suppose.
Yes, it was what?
To make a grand entrance, to make a speech from the front,
I think, it's 12 windows go in the front. So you have to put a door there. And I think probably of course, they were meeting in the winter, so maybe this is not that true, but the idea that, ventilation, and then also, I guess you could step out there and do your little presentation too. But that's you see that in a lot of structures, the upstairs door and the little small balcony on it. So it's not unusual. And it's the only way we can put 12 windows in the front.
I'm just curious as to why Cahaba was chosen as the site for the first state house.
Okay, now you've hit. I am a big defender of Governor Bibb because everybody go, oh, he picked this really crummy. And there's even a textbook where it's an old textbook that it has the people rowing in the second story window. And the story is Governor Bibb went to Cahaba and he met some Indians there and they said, Cahaba, Cahaba, which means water above. And he should have listened to them. And, he would have known that's a bad place to settle. Well, first of all, I think the fact that Cahaba means water above is not right. It really means extensive canebrake, which describes the river. And Cahaba was named after the river. And Cahaba was in the central part of the area. It was in the center of this rich cotton country. They were predicting that because the steamboats hadn't come yet, that was going to be near where the steamboats could go. And I have to say in his defense, okay, if you look at the reason they moved, it's mainly about like, well, you created this town out of nothing and that doesn't do it, just making it the capital. They moved, but Cahaba went on and prospered. And like I said, it was a center point for these rich cotton people in the south part of Dallas County. They had the fourth highest per capita income in the whole United States. We had the largest mansion, the grandest artesian well in the entire world, all these great structures and mansions that were built in the 1850s. If they would have just given it time, Cahaba proved to be a good place to put the capital. Now, the problem is Governor Bibb couldn't have known what we were going to do to the environment. He couldn't have known that we were going to cut down all these trees and dig up no more cane breaks. There's no native cane breaks anymore. And so that caused more silt and stuff to go in the river. So the floods got worse. And that's why we had flooding that didn't start until 1865. And it's gotten progressively worse since then, the worst floods since the dams, because now we have Walmart parking lots and we funnel all the water into the river. This is a long answer to your question, I know. But he picked it because it was a good place. Yeah.
We have time for another question.
But I'm a little biased. But I do think it.
Does anything remain of the mound that Governor Bibb wanted to build the Capitol on?
Not really. I mean, maybe might be some trace below ground. There's the remains of their village, but we know what happened to it. Well, I actually know where it is now. In 1858, they graded it away to make the embankment for the railroad. And John Tyler Morgan, who was living there at that time, gave a great speech at the inauguration of the railroad, all about their implements of warfare, their bones, and mingle in the dust, and talking about them doing that. And they even found some of the pottery, and they took it to lodges because they thought, DeSoto had introduced Freemasonry to the Indians because, it exists, but it now is underneath a road that leads into Cahaba. It was graded away to make this embankment. So there's a mound trail in Alabama, and we're on the mound trail, but we're the one with the missing mound. But I have to say, when I first came here, I'm a historical archaeologist, and the prehistorians were hunting for DeSoto. It was one of those anniversaries. And they did stop at Cahaba because they thought surely everything was disturbed. But instead, most of our structures were built up on piers or up off the ground like the State House. So we have an awful lot of intact features from the village that was there. Not the mound, but the homes and the other features that were associated with the village. And the moat, we've dug across the moat several places. It had been filled in too when they made the railroad, but it's still down there. It's amazing what's preserved. That's why we need archaeology as well as history. Because the stories are buried. They're out there. And not even buried. You could just go out there and look in the landscape and see a lot of history just by walking around down there. Did you have a question? Oh.
He asked the question.
Oh, you asked your question? Okay. All right. I think this is so exciting. This whole story of the town plan and the state house being trapezoidal. What other state has a cool story like that about their first state?
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation and teaching us something new about Alabama's first state house. And thank you to everyone who joined us. I hope to see you again in January for Dr. Rindfleisch's talk on George Galpin. And I hope that you all have a happy holidays and a very happy new year. Thank y'all.